All right. So, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for what I think is our eighth and final webinar of this series this spring. We were just discussing prior to the start of the program the speed at which things happen. It seems like January and February drag a little bit. But boy, once you hit March and April, things start to get pretty active, and I think that's where we are all in our schedules. So, and our guest speaker today will be our last of this series, as I've mentioned, and I think very nicely lines up with the topic of our grant, our research grant. Our guest today, if I might, is Dr. Crystal Tusi. Did I do okay on that, Crystal?
The T is silent, so it's Sosi.
Oh, Susie. Okay, thank you.
Sosi.
Susie. Good. Okay, and I might need some help on the next one. Do we say Dine
Dinette.
Navajo?
Dinette.
Dene Navajo Nation. She's an assistant professor in the School of Life Sciences at Arizona State University, where she's also an associate director of the Biodiversity Knowledge Integration Center. She'll tell us more about that. And very interesting, I found, she co-founded the Native Biodata Consortium, the first indigenous-led biological and data repository operating completely within the jurisdictional bounds of a U.S. tribal nation. So Crystal has a lot of background in this area and has a bit of an interesting path to her current position. Um, Educationally, one of her paths went through Vanderbilt. So I saw you had ASU, then Vanderbilt. And yeah, that's just marvelous. And I know you bring a lot of knowledge and experience in this. So I'm wondering if you could start, Crystal, by telling us a little bit about yourself. And then I'll follow up. And as we've done before, we'll kind of have a conversation.
Yeah. So, yat everyone, she Dr. Crystal Sosi, she can the chini nishlito na kaiden ipashchin, to the chin the shito lisistan dashinale. It's really my honor to speak to you today. I'm Navajo, Dine, both sides. And I'm actually a first generation college student. Both of my parents were products of the boarding school era, and federal policies related to termination and assimilation of our peoples. They did not go to college themselves. They are incredibly intelligent, though. I absolutely love their hardworking nature, something that I feel like I try to live up to as much as I can. I think actually, everyone in academia who works and in medicine who works well over 80 hours a week definitely have a drive and a spirit that I think can be attributed to our earlier generations. But my dad actually he's the reason that we moved off of the reservation onto into Phoenix. So he used to tour around the state of Arizona, work at different power plants, and then eventually had his permanent appointment at the power plant that operates for the Phoenix Indian Medical Center, which is the largest Indian Health Services facility. And he retired recently after 42 years of service. But that is where I had my first, of course, initial run-ins with physicians and medical personnel, but then also related to research. So my first volunteer experience was actually in the pathology and general laboratory at Phoenix Indian Medical Center, because like most Native Americans that are told to go and seek educations and benefit their communities, the four paths that we're usually told to go forward and pursue are to become a doctor, a lawyer, an engineer, or a teacher. So scientist wasn't one of them.
Hmm.
I decided to try to initially pursue a career as a physician. But the thing about working in a pathology department is, as much as I loved it, I learned that I was also in tension with a strong cultural taboo that Navajo people have against death. Such that many the IHS personnel that worked in the pathology department didn't actually perform an autopsy over a Native American individual for almost a decade. Actually,
Wow.
it was actually a veteran at the VA medical center. Um, so, and as I was moving samples back and forth between the clinical suites, the surgical ward, and moving across the sticky asphalt, black asphalt parking lot at the Phoenix City Medical Center, I was really more like interested in what causes disease
Mm,
because I remember instances, scenarios related towards like when I was really, really young old posters warning against hantavirus.
mm,
Then, of course, there were other like emerging questions related towards increased rates of cancer. And of course, my people come from high exposures to uranium as rooted in environmental racism and those types of policies. And I actually thought I was going to pursue a career first in laboratory related works, but then I eventually started transitioning, working with the Mayo Clinic, Scottsdale, and also then later Arizona State University's Biodesign Institute in the field of cancer biology. So I actually patented and published several papers on a tumor targeted device to image sites of early metastasis and also with ultrasound or ultrasound contrast agents that were targeted with bleomycin. And as much as I loved like this emerging space that bridged like imagery, MRI, and biomedical engineering in the space of cancer biology, and I was like first afforded this opportunity to pursue a PhD at the nation or perhaps even the world's top biomedical research institute, I actually really had my first run-ins with being the point of inquiry, scientific inquiry,
mm,
and also experiencing racism actually as an early career mentee, such that even though I was sort of surrounded by MDs and PhDs and MD PhDs at this really top-ranked institution, I remember people just talking about us as like we were a challenge to recruit
mm,
more people of color into studies,
mm,
but really not understanding our real lived experiences, not really understanding, oh, well, a drug that gets like goes through the pathways of innovation, if we're lucky enough for it to be translated to the market, will be a drug or a therapeutic that ultimately my people would not be able to afford.
mm,
So that caused like a really a fundamental internal conflict for me because like what good am I if I'm going to be one of the few Indigenous scientists with a PhD if in the field of cancer biology I don't see a direct impact for helping my people because of just like market motives and like just how research is conducted and the lack of representation in the field, the lack of particularly Indigenous mentors. I felt originally kind of alienated,
mm.
so this pivoted my journey to actually pursue a career in bioethics because it's like
Okay.
the intersection. Sorry, yes.
Can I ask you a question before
Yes,
you
yes.
go on? This is very interesting, but because you mentioned two things that I think it could be barriers to the kind of work that you were in prior. The one is sort of the lack of the cultural awareness.
Mm-hmm.
You mentioned the pathology and autopsies and so forth, and then you mentioned this perspective that some of the researchers had about these difficulties of studying indigenous people. How much of that inhibits the kind of science and I don't want to say clientele, they're not clientele, but population interactions? That must be a pretty prevalent issue.
It's an incredibly prevalent issue. So, for instance, I mean, I just spoke to Grand Rounds at the pathology department at UCLA. So, I was speaking exactly about this point, the lack of first active physicians in the workforce who identify as AIAN individuals, but then also further the lack of pathologists. It's like 14 of board certified clinical anatomical pathologists are identified as AIAN individuals. So it's like 0.5%.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow.
And there's a book by Dr. Arvizo Oliverd, who's like the first Navajo surgeon woman, female surgeon. And her quote was like, "We don't touch the dead as Navajos, like ever."
Interesting.
And that's really interesting because now there's this emerging conversation about shifting away from the practice of cadavers. And that shift actually is not to accommodate medical students with cultural and religious beliefs, although that is a potential positive if that's a concern for yours, but mostly because the cadaver dissection in general is currently the most common form of instructional use for
Sure.
me, but it's actually expected to decline because in favor of imaging, computerized teaching aids,
Oh,
and
sure.
that's due actually with the relative unavailability of instructors, anatomy instructors who are
Oh,
qualified to teach, and also budget. It's less about student learning styles and ethical considerations, but that could be a potential benefit if we're trying to build culturally competent medical education. So that's an interesting dynamic there.
yeah. So
Uh,
I'm sorry, I did interrupt your path there. You were on that pivot point. That's why I tried to
no, no,
freeze you
no.
to.
Let me speed it up. Because I pursued bioethics, the nexus of law and medicine, realized that I actually love science,
Mm,
but really wanted to pivot towards genetics and data science, and that's genetic epidemiology. That's what brought me to Vanderbilt University because I want to work in a university system that bridges variants across the genome with like sequence data with electronic health record data and that type of like clinical phenotype phenotyping algorithmic work. And as much as I loved it, I felt like really at odds with how models were being constructed on Native Americans. So this gets at the tension of how do we appropriately model race ethnicity
mm,
in genomics without being eugenic in nature? Because um, and this speaks to finally a shift in the field of genetic epidemiology and not calling it genetic ancestry, but really genetic similarity. Because functionally, that's what we're doing with statistics, is that we are categorizing individuals with a percentage of set independent markers, biomarkers, and basically asking what percentage of the subset of biomarkers has like similarity to a reference group. And
mm,
some reference groups are fairly well sampled and fairly well characterized, those that are of like that emerge from individuals with Eastern like or European ancestry, or certain sub-Saharan African regions have like over tens of thousands of individuals in those reference groups.
mm,
But for indigenous peoples in the Americas, there are only 5 publicly available reference groups, and those come from groups outside the US, in Mexico, Central America, and South America. And when
interesting.
you think about like how many nations that we have just in the colonial continental US that are recognized and unrecognized, and you think about just like the cultural diversity, there's also a lot of genetic diversity that's not captured when we're only looking at these same 5 reference groups in like a distinct geographic region.
Right, right.
And some of these groups have just as few as 30 individuals.
Wow.
So we're not really doing data science very well, actually. And when you look at like how most consumers interact with their own personal genomes, with direct-to-consumer genetic ancestry testing or other types of testing, like these types of stats are like buried in like the fine print, like asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. You have to read all these other like ancillary white papers, but that's still in like direct opposition almost with how they're marketed. So
So can I interject here? Maybe just another thought or question, because it appears to me that there are maybe two issues that you're dealing with. One is the lack of a comprehensive data set that closer represents the populations that you're talking about within the U.S. The second is that you mentioned this idea of how the research and what I call algorithms or such are biased or maybe biased, right? Written biases that don't represent or don't explore. And then the third one you just mentioned is if it is explored and defined, it's way down. The reports are way down buried in the so all of this seems to me to speak to the issue of inequity, like throughout the process.
mhm.
Is that am I capturing that correctly?
Yes, definitely for sure, but it's also how we're choosing to define equity or inequities.
Mm,
So going back to the point that I made earlier, a lot of genetic research and genetic medicine papers, they start with this premise of Indigenous peoples still constitute less than 1% of participants in clinical trials or genomics research. Therefore, we just need more people that are recruited into studies. It's like, no, that is incredibly simplistic.
mm,
And it ignores the reason why Indigenous peoples don't feel comfortable with taking part in the studies. And when you really start unpacking the central reasons related to trust and mistrust of
mm,
research and researchers, it actually has to do with inequities related to data decision of the genomic data. Like what happens to data that results from Indigenous peoples? Who does it actually benefit? There have been too many instances in which we have seen where researchers have entered into Indigenous communities, have promised therapeutics in exchange for their genomic material, and then have left. And then communities later learn that the genetic material is being sold or as part of like
mm.
their cell lines are being are purchasable by other researchers, right? And so they're not getting the benefit. And then also, I have spoken to researchers themselves on sort of trying to advocate for the importance of community engaged approaches. And unfortunately, many researchers still utilize community engagement as yet another synonym for recruitment. It's like we're only going to engage with communities with the express endpoint of recruiting them into studies. I'm like, no,
Oh,
that's not exactly the point of the recruit of engagement.
right.
Engagement is supposed to be bi-directional and it's supposed to be more cooperative in nature. And there's still this power dynamic in play of, oh, we're the researchers, we get the data, you're the subject. And like that's not the point of community-based participatory
So
research.
all of these outcomes are add to the layers of
Mhm.
historical um, offenses, and it doesn't do much to help today's indigenous populations have that trust, right, in the scientific community, because they're looked at as kind of objects of study rather than I really appreciate what you said there about engagement. Engagement is not a recruiting tool. It's a
Mhm.
two-way conversation.
Mhm.
And researchers have to establish that in order to build the trust in order to move forward.
Exactly. There's also this point of we haven't there's an entire subdiscipline emerging about benefit as well.
Mm.
Benefit sharing and how exactly are we thinking or conversing about the actual derived benefits of research and do they proximally serve the people that are providing the data that bring about the innovations?
Mm,
Um, so for instance, going back to like the example, the sort of trope example, it is, I think Indigenous communities are sick of the status quo of feeling like they are providing biological material and then not providing getting any medicinal or therapeutic benefit out of it. And it's not
wow.
enough for them to wait decades for the pathway of innovation to somehow
Sure.
passively direct them in the future. And it also speaks, I think, to just the how these decisions are made and how much they're driven by the market. So when we
Mm,
started the Native Biodata Consortium, we had a soft launch at the American Society of Human Genetics, which is the largest human genetics organization, professional society in the world, certainly. And right afterwards, we had like three pharmaceutical companies ask us as Indigenous scholars, you know, how many Indigenous peoples are part of or representing your database and across what phenotypes, right? So we took the meetings and we came prepared with a list of conditions that primarily impact Indigenous peoples. So the term rare variant is actually a relative term.
mm,
Things that are rare in the general population may not be rare for our communities, a small
mm,
community, right? So we came prepared with a list of like metabolic conditions and childhood conditions that have rates that would be considered conditions of disparity because they're more highly prevalent in our communities compared to dominant populations. And we asked the very simple question, why can't we use our genomic DNA to study these conditions that primarily impact us?
mm.
And the results from the pharmaceutical companies were, you constitute less than 3% of the population. It is
Oh,
not profit generative
sure,
to do that approach. To
sure.
which that, of course, should ask the question, if like I don't like the term democratization of research, especially not as a synonym for equity, because
Mm,
the system of majority wins or we do what's right for the majority is such a utilitarian argument that is
mm,
always going to disenfranchise disempowered communities and
mm,
small populations. And
mm,
if we are going to state that we want to expand equity or improve equity or change the dynamics of research to benefit all, then we also have to address these other profit and market motives, and also how data decisions are made and who makes those governance decisions. Because there's a huge pathway of extraction of data from Native Americans in the clinic through clinical genetic testing,
mm.
where providers may not even realize that they're a part of this pathway because they're just focused on delivering the best care possible to an Indigenous patient. But what they may not realize is that the representation of gene variants that are related to Indigenous peoples is actually quite poor.
Mm,
So, a negative test result may be a function of not having that variant adequately assayed as part of that test.
sure, sure.
And just
Mm,
by prescribing a test, a clinical genetic test to an Indigenous patient, already that laboratory facility and the parent company can own that data. And even if a Native American patient knows to opt out of data sharing, that data is still retained by the company for quality assurance purposes. Also, it's deposited in, like if it's a novel variant, into public databases like ClinVar.
mm,
And then you start getting into this whole other space about how like biomedical research ethics is very is more regulated in terms of how we define it in informed consent, but that's not the same type of ethic in industry, and it's not the same type of ethic in the public health domain.
right.
And now we're just like blending data across all of these spaces in data harmonization in this
Mm.
open data climate.
So this is fascinating, and you're kind of opening up my mind to a lot of the challenges in this space. I want to go back to that. You mentioned the data decisions and who's making them and who has control to say what you do with my data. Does I don't know how to ask this. Does the relationship from the pharmaceuticals to indigenous populations and their data, is it different than what happens in other populations? Like I'm a white Caucasian male, right? I don't often feel like I have much control of what, the data that's being generated. I guess sometimes I get asked about, do I want to be in a study and such? But I guess in my case, I am assuming that the results are going to benefit me somehow. And it sounds like with you, what you're talking about, that's not an assumption. That's not a true assumption, right?
Well, okay, there's two things. One, the pathway for healthcare delivery to a tribal member or an indigenous person through the Indian Health Services is going to be different than in other groups that
Mm.
rely on other types of healthcare systems, right? And the funding to an IHS patient before the pandemic was something like 3.4 times less compared to the dominant population. And that disparity is even greater post-pandemic. So we're funding preventative health at rates lower to a tribal member who seeks care through IHS compared to everyone else.
Mm.
So, like, we're trying to oversell the promises of precision medicine to people who can't even equitably get access to preventative health care. That is a function of systemic racism embedded in policy, in funding decisions for policy.
Explain that a little bit to me.
Well, I
What do you
mean,
mean by that?
these are embed relations that have been embedded in treaties. Like for these are historic treaties
Oh,
where tribal nations brokered some sort of agreement with the colonial government in exchange for access to land and resource. We were supposed to be granted access to certain things like healthcare, but then like the same government that has also instituted policies of termination of our peoples, like this is the same government that put our kids in boarding schools,
mhm.
and turned a blind eye while our children were dying, is also going to fairly fund healthcare for our peoples?
Sure,
Probably not.
sure. Yeah.
But it's also a disservice to continually, as researchers, tell tribal nation leaders, hey, you need to facilitate the recruitment of your people into studies. Otherwise, your people are just going to continue to miss out on genomics medicine. That's also a disservice because it's almost like victim blaming. Like, oh, the reason why your people are not
Sure,
getting better is because you're not participating. But the
sure,
system is stacked against us. There has to be fundamental shifts in how we conduct research and think about informed consent and think about data decision making authorities and data
sure.
sovereignty for our peoples to really think about equal equity and equal access to our data and also thinking about benefit sharing. Like,
How would you like, if you had the opportunity to change that, what would that narrative sound like to you? Of
um,
trying
yes.
to get I'm trying to get engagement from a certain population. Now you've got all this background, you've got all this history, you've got all these offenses. How do you change that? What's the
Well,
language that you would use?
Well, I've actually decided to not even operate within the system. This is where
Um,
I and other indigenous geneticists, we decided, okay, if we're going to return tribal data back to indigenous communities, and let them decide what type of research that they want to participate, if they want to participate at all. How
mm,
do we make sure that their research interests are reflected? So then
mm,
this means we are co-producing research questions and research studies
mhm.
with community members.
Sure.
Already the research questions are better in quality because they are
Wow.
created by the people that live and have seen firsthand the changes to their traditional diets and lifestyles and the impacts on their health. Of course, they're going to have better research questions than
Wow.
somebody that doesn't have that same fundamental understanding. I have seen in the genetic epidemiology side, data scientists who just like change the outcome, like they just switch out the phenotype, like a Rolodex, and then
Mm.
they just, add like some covariates that are supposed to be reflective of race ethnicity, and they call it health disparities research. And they're
Oh.
not even asking whether or not the research question is even relevant for our peoples. This is actually something that the NIH NEDDK had a lot of a criticism from a Southwestern community because this is an instance where community members who had high rates of type 2 diabetes were asked to participate in a longitudinal study run by the NIH, and then learned later, the community members learned that their samples were being used to study type 1 diabetes, which doesn't even
Oh.
impact them, right? And so going back to when we
Mm.
co-produce research questions, now people are asking, well, what does that mean when we start thinking about environmental
Mm.
factors related to health? What does it mean when we start thinking about changes to our cultural and our traditional lifestyles and lifeways on and impacting our health? What does it mean when we think about intergenerational shifts? And when they are when they see that the data that's being generated is also housed in their lands, that's protected under their tribal nations laws, they feel more trust to
Mm.
engage in that type of research.
But
And
mm,
it's been so meaningful for Native Bio because we've been so
yeah.
successful at that model.
What you're
Sorry.
what you're describing, you're changing, or you're describing a change in the word engagement. The first example you gave of engagement was the thing that came to my mind was that you're being used, and you feel like you're being used. You're being told, "Hey, we want to engage with you," but it's really we want to take from you.
That's
This
engagement
description,
washing.
yeah,
Yeah.
this description is one of we want to partner with, we want to work with you. You're the closest to the demographics, to the data sets. You know what to look for. Become a partner in this exploration. That's marvelous.
It's
Are you
actually a
ready?
step, it's actually a step even more.
Okay.
It's a tribally directed research, is what it is.
Hmm.
Where the research questions start from the tribes, the data is held from the tribes, and then researchers have to work within tribal nation rules and within their interests if they want to partner. So
Interesting.
now the power dynamic has shifted so that the data is retained more locally. And then not only do you change the game, you also start thinking about building biodata-based economies for tribal nations. So going back to what I stated earlier, like a lot of these treaties were really cloaked mechanisms for usurping our land rights or our rights to water and other types of resources. And these are the same type of resources that we needed to create forms of revenue and capital for our communities to be self-sustaining. So when we think about all these emerging data markets and these data economies that have erupted, it's largely based off of untapped or undiscovered populations that haven't historically participated in research. That
Hmm.
describes us. You were asking earlier about like whether or not this is a question that relates to you. Yes, always.
Hmm.
If we can improve on how we do informed consent and it benefits everyone, perfect. If we can
Yeah.
improve on
Yeah.
public education and people understand that their data, no matter who they are, is commercializable and is could be owned by somebody else, yes, that benefits you. But then on top of that, like the targeted
Mm,
So the early parts of genomic medicine in the early 2000s was focusing on common variants in the population contributing to common diseases.
mm,
And now we have shifted towards like rare variants. What are the things that we haven't seen yet in populations that we haven't studied or partnered with? And again, that's indigenous people. So we have been described as like fonts for undiscovered genetic variation. And then so you have like this frontier like science verbiage describing us, which is
yeah.
weird and it's creepy. But it also tells you
Uh,
that there's this heightened interest then in finding new gene variants from indigenous peoples to benefit perhaps the study of researcher conditions that don't even impact us but impact other people.
sure,
And that's biopiracy, that's a
sure.
colonialism, that's extraction. And if we
I
can do
I was going to
better,
say, Crystal, that sounds like perpetuating the same model that for 200 or 300 years or whatever number of years we've been doing this. It's the same model. It's not changing things. It's
well,
taking advantage of a population, right? It
mhm.
maybe to serve someone else, but probably not the original population.
Yeah, so anyway, so how do we move beyond it? Giving power back to communities. One is like giving them mechanisms for having data decision making authorities that benefit them directly and first. But then also think about ways to protect communities that don't want to participate in research. How do we ensure that their autonomy is also preserved?
Mm.
And also, like, how do we start building like data solutions that also positively impact people? So better research questions, as I mentioned earlier, but then also like how can we start building using like machine learning approaches to start facilitating now these more complex informed consent pathways? How do we improve upon just broad and blanket consent models and then like move toward adaptive consent, like tiered or dynamic consent? How do we use blockchain to prevent unconsented secondary data sharing? It used to be like, for instance, if a tribal nation brokered a relationship with a researcher to study A, there was
Mhm.
no way to stop that researcher from sharing data with
Sure.
a graduate student or a collaborator to study some other condition that that community didn't consent to.
Without
But
permission, right?
without permission.
Yeah.
So if we can start using like these digital ledger systems to track these transactions or these data, these instances of sharing data, just block that unconsented data sharing to begin with. You can block the harm before it starts, hopefully. So we're not just chasing down researchers to hold them accountable to their own actions after the fact, but now we can place community members as authority nodes to decide like who gets access to what before that data gets released.
Have you found when you've had communicate or when you've had interactions with your populations, your home community and such, have you found these ideas resonating? Are they people kind of perking up and say, yeah, now that sounds like something I would want to be involved in?
Oh, yes, actually. So, and in fact, it's not just tribal community members and indigenous peoples that like our model, and they love our model. We are so happy to be able to use philanthropic funds to create our dynamic consent portal. We've invested over $1 million into it, and we want to license it for tribal nations for free so that they can manage their own data. We've
Mm.
had many tribal nations within the US and outside the US ask us how we constructed our our organization so that they could replicate it on their own if they're like a community that has some size or some resources. And
Mm,
if they don't have like that local capacity to partner with us so that we can serve as stewards for them. And then we've also been working with like non-Indigenous university partners that don't want the university to have claim over the data, because now like just being employees in a university setting under the Bayh-Dole Act, universities
mm.
can claim intellectual property ownership
Sure,
over.
sure.
Yeah, and now universities have huge tech transfer offices, and then just by partnering with the community, we've had to like counteract with like memorandums of agreement and data sharing, access, use, and permissions, like contract law to
Yeah.
protect communities. But some universities, they just like either want to repatriate or rematriate data back to tribal community members because it's just sitting in their freezers, and they
Mm,
feel the more ethically conscionable to just give it back or
mm.
return it, or they want to see like any innovations benefit more directly tribal community members
Sure,
over their
sure.
universities or their institutions. And even like outside of like indigenous communities, other communities that have felt disenfranchised and disempowered love our model as well. So you have patient advocacy groups who are also
Mm,
have a lot of interest from drug companies for studying rare variants. We're learning from each other on these community-based data governance principles. And then
wow.
other communities, like for instance, Black communities in the Southeast, like we share a lot of our like governance principles and ethics back and forth as well. So it's one of those things that if we could do it better, we can benefit other people.
I could
And
just see this ripple effect though that you're talking about into, and that's why you say, oh, this affects me as well, right? No matter what demographic you're from,
mhm,
these the principles, and I think you've so well honed in on the issue of being agency.
mhm.
Populations, individuals want control and they want some say as to how their information gets used.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
Love it.
So, are you seeing, I'm just curious, when you go into your communities, are you seeing an interest in science and STEM fields, in genetics? I gotta say, genetics is not my thing, but as you're talking about it, Crystal, it really sounds exciting. It sounds like I don't know, like you're uncovering more information about who we are as human beings.
Yes. Okay, so first, before I step back into the human realm, I want to acknowledge that the study of genomics is one that Indigenous peoples are interested in, like the non-human space as well.
Hmm.
There's this point of like kinship and understanding relationality that is like beyond these arbitrary species lines, that we have to care for our kin species around us, right? And part of this is thinking about not only food waste, traditional food waste, and sovereignty as it relates. It's also protecting traditional plant knowledges, which are often the sources of medicinal knowledge as well. So thinking about just tribal colleges and universities, there are 35 of them in the US. Of the ones that have genomics like education curricula, it's in the spaces of environmental science, actually, for
Oh,
conservation purposes and sustainability,
interesting.
because of that huge sense of stewardship for protecting the land around us, right? So thinking about these approaches of bringing sequencing technologies into tribal nations, so that, for instance, and this is like a program that we run called Indigidata, which is a 1 week summer education program where we actually host workshops on tribal lands. We have like demonstrated that sequencing technologies can be used for tribal fisheries to help them like control against the encroachment of, for instance, like invasive species
Sure,
that might impact their culturally relevant fish species.
sure.
We could think about and this speaks to like indigenous peoples have are we we we've done genetic engineering and genetic modification on our own, right? Like Tia Sente to their modern day corn, that was thousands of years of cultivation and understanding and a sort of directing these different trait adaptations for the types of food systems that are important to us. So when you think about it in that space, it's really then not much of a shift to think about the integration of and the training of indigenous peoples in the spaces of human genetics and genomics. And this is where I feel like I'm so grateful to come back to Arizona State University. ASU is a incredibly large research R1 institution, and it has the largest concentration of Indigenous students with the largest numbers of Indigenous faculty members. But until I came back, we did not have an Indigenous faculty member in the School of Life Sciences, which is one of
Oh,
the largest units in the university, and certainly the one that you would think about a discipline like human biology being studied. And just by coming back then, now I defended less than 3 years ago, now have a lab of 12 to include me, and we have 75% Indigenous
wow,
representation across different global tribal peoples in undergraduate, master's, PhD, and postdoc level. And
wow.
these are all people that were just waiting for an Indigenous mentor.
Yeah.
And I've been able to attract other Indigenous mentees in Canada and serve on their dissertation committees or master's committees as
Mm,
well. And just building this community of people who may not be like genetics researchers, but are definitely utilizing genetic approaches in their
sure.
professions. And this is why it's so important to have representation in sciences, even though, I guess I'm not supposed to say that right now in this anti-DEI administration, but
Yeah, I hear
that
you.
speaks to the
Mm,
importance of having people from communities
mm.
doing work that impacts community members.
One of the things that you mentioned that kind of broadened my understanding, you connected the dots between human genomes and study of genomes to other life sciences, the plants, the animals, the fish, and so forth. You describe this as a kind of a holistic. It's really one system. It's not humans and everything else. It's humans and these other living organisms. I love thinking about that as a representation, and I think we have so much to learn from that conceptual model of us living here on this big blue dot together, not as superior to other kinds of things. It really resonates with me.
Thank you so much.
So
Um,
I got to
yes.
pivot just a little bit because I'm watching our time and I really want to get to a couple of things. So our faculty members and our students are writing assignments on a varied, it's really a STEAM project, not just STEM. And they're writing assignments that help create an awareness on the part of the students to health inequities in their communities. That's the gist of the project. And I'm wondering if you can help direct the faculty members and the students where to look for the kinds of discrepancies, disparities that you've kind of talked about in their communities. And I'm thinking I can think of different methods to get there. I can think of a writing assignment that might explore an interview with and it wouldn't have to be an indigenous. It might be my Hispanic relatives because the concepts you've talked about are universal, and I really think that's the beauty of what you're doing. What you're doing is you're changing kind of how some of these the relationships change. But let me go back to that question. Are there Is there advice or direction you can give us on where we might look?
There's an essay, first of all, like when I think of the arts, of course I think of visual arts, but then there's also other types of arts related to like language and poetry and that I think we need to also be to recognize that have dealt with some of these issues that might be STEM based, but
Mm,
really thinking about epistemologies and like fundamental conflicts of
mm,
epistemologies that undergird like how we think about sciences and engineering and mathematics. Um, but then so there's a great essay called Making Kin with the Machines.
slow down, say that again.
Making Kin with the Machines.
Oh.
It's written by four indigenous um, scholars, but they are also like some of these are computer graphics artists.
Mm,
Um, and and
mm,
and they really talk about like in essay form. It's gorgeous how the different
mm,
components of their collective essay work is talking about this responsibility to care for our non-human kin, but that also should include the AI that we're creating, right? So there's a
mm,
responsibility for stewardship of the AI. Another example that I think is kind of interesting is to think about like asking students to use an AI generator to build to representations of scientists. Um, there have been a couple of projects to sort of retrain algorithms that when you search scientists to not just return like a white male,
yeah,
but
yeah.
to also return women and also other people of color and other types of diverse representations. And but it's also a useful training device too, to ask students to generate an AI image of like a scientist and ask like, is this properly reflecting of like who you are?
Mm,
Um, and that is also, and you can also like ask the question of how is cultural imagery trained? Because is it drawing from data that is actually in it at its root culturally appropriated?
mhm,
And this also brings like representation is important, but also being respectful that we're not appropriating knowledges and images is also
right.
important too. So
Mm,
that is like a great conversation to have. We're also thinking about like different art forms for how to capture stories and narratives.
mm,
So there have been a number of great projects like rooted in libraries for capturing oral stories from different peoples that are
mhm,
beautiful. But I also love thinking, like for instance,
mm,
I'm thinking because this year's topic is on digital health and artificial intelligence this year at Arizona State. ASU has something called Dreamscape where they have like the VR headsets and there's a Diné person there that wants to use virtual reality and augmented reality as like a way to narrate stories that are culturally
mm,
relevant. And then I'm also thinking about this project from a young astronomy student that wanted to like build a like more inclusive collection of cosmologies and stories to not just think of as constellations as being like in like the quote unquote Western model, but think about how other cultures think about constellations as well. So I
wow.
think students are just super creative actually. So
Yeah.
letting them giving them the ability to let their minds wander is just so important.
And
Especially
maybe reduce some of the constraints or the boundaries that we have, right?
Mhm,
And let those student minds do that creative work.
exactly.
Crystal, if you had students, if you had an opportunity to speak to students today about sort of following your career path, replicating it, doing something, how would you, what kind of careers would you describe where they might wind up?
Mm. So first, I always tell students, it's just important to understand what you don't want to do as much as you want to
Oh,
understand what you want to do, right? Because some career paths are just incompatible with their
mm,
what makes them thrive, and that's important to know.
sure.
But if they want to pursue like an interdisciplinary background in genomics and ethics, there are a lot of great venues. They don't just have to become a principal investigator in an academic setting,
Mm,
but they could work with nonprofits. They could one of my students is thinking about intellectual property law, actually,
mm,
as it relates to ownership of biological materials.
mm,
Other students that I that have like genetic counselors is an emerging field that we need. Like thinking of like other allied health professions that's not just becoming an MD or a DO, like
sure.
yeah, students who don't even know that nurse practitioners are an option, or these other types of like laboratory, like clinical laboratory professions. Like there's so many different ways to utilize this type of genomic training and background, and that the few that I mentioned don't even scratch the surface related to data ethics and data policy either.
Sure.
Yeah,
And that gets into more of the the engineering side and the technology side. It sounds like the paths available in this particular career domain could be so broad and so varied.
exactly.
And it also strikes me as being a very topical career area to be searching and seeking. So there's a lot there for us to be thinking about. Crystal, you've really done a marvelous job of painting for us the kind of the current state on the research domains and the data management. I think what you're involved in is just so exciting, and we all have so much to learn from that. So I want to just thank you for taking the time today and sharing with us as we look forward to moving on these designing the assignments. Any last thoughts you might want to leave with us?
Oh, we need more allies in the space. We need people
Mm,
to understand the power of data and the importance of ethics. So it doesn't matter what type of discipline you end up choosing. If there's data involved, there are a lot of underlying questions. And once you start like teasing apart that bundle of knots, it starts taking you in career trajectories and just knowledge trajectories that you wouldn't anticipate. So just enjoy the journey.
yeah, wonderful. Thank you. Thank you,
Thanks.
Crystal. This has been illuminating to say the least. Really appreciate your insights.
Thank you.
With that, I'm going to segue to Debbie. Debbie, you said you might have a